Good evening, all, and welcome back to Dark Fears. Tonight, we journey into the frozen heart and forgotten corners of British Columbia. Through isolated small towns, endless wilderness, and places where help does not reach, to uncover 7 of the most disturbing and terrifying small-town horror stories ever recorded. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Dark Fears for daily horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of British Columbia, where civilization ends and terror begins. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and this happened when I was 27, working as a temporary surveyor near a dying logging town called Pine Hollow, deep in British Columbia. I took the job because it paid well, and because I needed distance. From my divorce, from the noise of Vancouver, from people asking questions I couldn't answer. Pine Hollow had fewer than 100 residents left, most of them older men who stared too long and spoke too little. From my first night, something felt off. The forest wasn't quiet the way forests usually are. It hummed, low and constant, like a breath being held. Locals warned me not to walk after dark, especially near the old logging roads. They said it casually, like advice about slippery steps, but their eyes told a different story. The cabin provided by my employer sat alone at the tree line. Every night around 2:17 a.m., I woke to faint whispering beneath the floorboards. Soft, layered voices, repeating my name as if they were learning how to say it. At first, I blamed stress. Old cabins make noise, I told myself. Wood shifts, pipes knock. But whispers don't pronounce your name correctly on the first try. The next morning, I asked Graham, a local mechanic, if anyone else had stayed in that cabin recently. His hands froze mid-wipe, grease streaking the rag. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked if I slept well. When I mentioned the voices, his face tightened, like I'd said something forbidden. He told me Pine Hollow used to sit on top of a sinkhole system, natural caverns running for miles beneath the town. Years ago, a section collapsed, taking 3 houses with it. The bodies were never recovered. After that, people started hearing things under their homes. That night, I placed my phone on the floor to record. At 2:17 a.m., the whispers returned, clearer now. Multiple voices, overlapping, urgent, and beneath them all, something else. A slow, wet sound, like movement through mud, directly under my bed. The recording changed everything. When I listened back the next morning, I expected faint murmurs, maybe static shaped by my fear. Instead, I heard a conversation, not random whispers. Voices arguing, overlapping, some angry, some pleading. They weren't speaking to me anymore. They were speaking about me. One voice, low and deliberate, said, "He hears us now." Another responded, sharper, "Not yet. He still walks above." I took the recording to Graham. He listened in silence, jaw clenched, then unplugged my phone like it was dangerous. He told me the old miners used to say the caverns weren't empty, that when the sinkholes collapsed, they didn't just bury houses, they opened pathways to something that mimicked the dead, because it had learned that grief was a door humans always opened. That afternoon, I noticed footprints circling my cabin, bare, elongated, pressed deep into the mud. They didn't lead away. They only led closer, forming a slow, tightening ring around my door. I decided to leave that night. I packed fast, hands shaking, ignoring the way the forest had gone unnaturally silent. As I stepped onto the porch, the whispering began again, but not from below. It came from the trees. Hundreds of voices, perfectly synchronized, speaking my name with confidence now. The ground beneath the cabin shifted. I heard wood crack, not from age, but from pressure pushing upward. The floorboards bowed as if something massive was pressing from the caverns below, testing the shape of my home. Then the voices changed. They sounded hopeful, excited. "They always run?" one voice said. "Not this one," another replied. I sprinted for my truck. As the engine turned over, the earth behind me collapsed inward, swallowing the cabin in a roar of snapping timber and dirt. For a moment, I saw movement in the sinkhole. Shapes layered together, faces half-formed, reaching upward not with hands, but with memories. I drove until sunrise. Pine Hollow no longer appears on maps. But some nights, at exactly 2:17 a.m., my floor vibrates softly, like something far below remembering my name. I tried to convince myself it was over. I sold my equipment, moved into a downtown apartment, surrounded myself with noise and light. For a while, it worked. Then the dreams started. I would find myself standing beneath Pine Hollow, inside a vast cavern supported by roots and broken beams, the walls pulsing like lungs. Faces formed in the stone, neighbors I barely spoke to, men I'd seen once at the gas station, watching me with patient hunger. What terrified me most was that they weren't angry. They were waiting. In the dreams, they spoke calmly, explaining that the ground above had collapsed again, that more people had joined them. That space was opening. I contacted Graham, desperate for confirmation that Pine Hollow still existed. His number no longer worked. Online, the town was listed as abandoned due to geological instability. No photos, no reports, like it had been erased. That night, my apartment floor vibrated at 2:17 a.m. Not loudly, just enough to feel intentional, like a knock from below, reminding me the distance meant nothing anymore. The whispers followed me everywhere after that. Subway platforms, hotel rooms, even crowded cafes. Always faint, always layered, always beneath whatever surface I stood on. I stopped sleeping on beds and started sleeping on couches, then on the floor, as if distance from elevation might help. It didn't. One night, the voices changed tone. They sounded proud. They told me Pine Hollow was never meant to last. The town's like it were seeds, planted where the ground was thin enough to listen. They said some places don't collapse by accident. They open. I felt it then. A subtle pull in my chest, like gravity pointing downward instead of forward. The realization hit me harder than fear. They didn't want my body. They wanted my attention, my belief, my listening. Because the more I heard them, the clearer they became. And now sometimes, when I stand still, I swear I can feel hollow spaces beneath every city I walk through. Waiting to be remembered, waiting to be fed, I started researching other towns. Places that vanished quietly, explained away by floods, landslides, or economic decline. The patterns were impossible to ignore. Each place sat above cave systems, abandoned mines, or unstable bedrock. Each had reports of sounds beneath homes years before the evacuations. Whispers, knocking, voices people dismissed as pipes or stress. The worst discovery came from a forum thread buried deep online. A man from northern Alberta described the same 2:17 a.m. vibration. A woman from Montana mentioned dreams of underground faces learning her voice. None of them knew each other. None of them had ever heard of Pine Hollow. That's when I understood the truth. Pine Hollow wasn't unique. It was an early stage. The whispers grew clearer after that realization, more confident. They didn't hide anymore. They spoke to me like a messenger, explaining that once someone listens long enough, the ground remembers them. and remembered people become invitations. Every night now, I feel the earth beneath me shifting, aligning, like something far below is finding the fastest way up. I tried to fight it by drowning out the sound. White noise machines, music playing through headphones while I slept. Construction-grade ear protection, none of it worked. The voices didn't travel through air. They traveled through structure, through foundation, bone, memory. One night, I felt pressure beneath my feet so strong I collapsed. The floor didn't break, but it softened, like damp soil. The whispers erupted into celebration. They told me I had done well, that listening was the hardest part, that soon others would hear me the way I heard them. That terrified me more than anything else. The idea that I could become a signal. Now, when people stand near me too long, they sometimes ask if I feel that. A faint vibration, a hum beneath the ground. I always tell them it's nothing, just the city settling. But I see the moment it clicks in their eyes, the moment they start listening. And I know another hollow place has just been chosen. I stopped pretending I was normal. I quit my job, cut contact with friends, and moved constantly, never staying anywhere long enough for the ground to get comfortable with me. Motels, short-term rentals, anywhere with thin walls and no basement. Still, the whispers followed. They always do. What changed was their patience. They no longer begged or warned. They instructed. They showed me images when I closed my eyes, towns I'd never visited, streets I'd never walked, places where the ground was already listening. They wanted me to go there, to stand, to wait. One night in a roadside motel, the vibration came early. 1:43 a.m. The floor sagged slightly beneath my weight, like it was breathing. The voices spoke in unison for the first time. "You are not falling," they said. "You are arriving." That's when I understood the final truth. Pine Hollow didn't collapse because people lived there. It collapsed because something below finally learned how to call them home. I'm writing this from a place I won't name. Not because I'm afraid, but because naming places makes them easier to find. The whispers are calm now, satisfied. They don't rush me anymore. They know gravity always wins. Sometimes, when I stand still, I feel a gentle pull downward, like the earth is waiting with open arms. I think that's how it starts. Not with fear, with familiarity. With the comforting sense that something understands you completely because it has been listening the entire time. If you ever hear faint voices beneath your floor late at night, don't investigate. Don't record them. Don't listen closely. Because the moment you recognize words, the ground recognizes you back. And it never forgets. My name is Lucas Moreau, and this happened when I was 32, after my wife Emily and I moved to a small coastal town in British Columbia called Ravens Creek. We came for a reset. Emily had lost her sister the year before, and I thought the quiet would help her breathe again. Ravens Creek promised that. Foggy mornings, slow tides, and a population small enough that everyone waved, even if they didn't know your name. The first thing we noticed was the lights. Not street lights, not boats. They appeared offshore just after sunset. Soft, pale orbs hovering above the water, drifting slowly as if deciding where to go. The locals barely acknowledged them. When I asked our landlord, he shrugged and said the lights had always been there. Emily didn't like them. She said they made her feel watched. I laughed it off. But that night, from our bedroom window, I saw one of the lights drift closer to shore and pause as if it knew exactly where we were sleeping. Within a week, the lights began responding to us. That's the only way I can describe it. When Emily stood on the beach, one would drift closer. When she stepped back, it followed, never touching land, always hovering just beyond the tide line. She stopped going outside after sunset. I started asking questions. At the diner, an old fisherman told me the lights weren't new. He said people used to follow them out to sea, thinking they were boats in trouble. Some never came back. Others returned. Different. Quiet, hollow. Like something had been scooped out and replaced with patience. That night, Emily woke me up, gripping my arm so hard it hurt. She said the lights were outside the house, not offshore. Outside. I looked through the living room window and felt my stomach drop. 3 pale orbs hovered just above the sand dunes, illuminating the fog from within. And slowly, deliberately, they began moving toward our front door, leaving no footprints, only a growing certainty that whatever guided them knew exactly who it was here for. I opened the door before Emily could stop me. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe. Or the strange calm the lights seemed to project, like standing too close to a fire on a cold night. The moment the door creaked open, the orbs retreated a few feet, hovering patiently, as if rewarding caution. Up close, they weren't solid. Their edges rippled, like light struggling to hold a shape. I felt pressure in my ears, the way you do when diving too deep. Behind me, Emily whispered that she could hear something. Voices layered beneath the hum, speaking softly, kindly, promising relief from grief. The next day, we learned the previous tenants had left abruptly. Their car was still parked behind the house, keys inside. The landlord claimed they'd gone inland, but no one in town could tell us where. That evening, the lights returned earlier than before. More of them this time, and for the first time, they didn't stay outside. One slipped beneath the house, illuminating the crawl space with a sickly glow, like it was learning the layout. Emily changed after that. She started standing at the window for hours, watching the lights drift offshore and back again, as if they were keeping time just for her. When I tried to pull her away, she snapped, harder than I'd ever seen, telling me they understood her pain in a way I never could. She began sleepwalking. Twice, I woke to find the front door open and wet sand tracked across the floor. The third time, I followed her. She moved calmly, barefoot, straight toward the water, the lights parting ahead of her like guides. I shouted her name. She stopped, turned slowly, and smiled. It wasn't relief or happiness. It was acceptance. She said the lights showed her where her sister went, that the ocean didn't take people. It returned them, rearranged. Behind her, the fog thickened, glowing from within as shapes formed inside the light. Tall, indistinct silhouettes waiting at the edge of the tide, patient and impossibly still. I pulled Emily back before she reached the water. She didn't fight me. That was worse. She went limp, like someone who had already decided the outcome and didn't care how it happened anymore. The lights reacted immediately. They dimmed, not fading, but withdrawing, like disappointed spectators. The next morning, I went into town alone. I demanded answers. An older woman at the general store finally spoke, her voice low, careful. She said the lights were called the Returners, by the people who'd lived here long before the town had a name. They didn't take bodies, she explained. They took direction. They showed the grieving a path forward, one that led away from everyone else. She told me some people followed the lights into the water. Others followed them into the forest. A few simply walked inland and were never seen again. The town didn't stop it because stopping it never worked. The lights didn't force anyone. They just waited until someone wanted to go. That night, Emily packed a small bag. She said she was ready, I tried everything. I begged. I reminded her of the life we were building, the plans we'd made, the future she once believed in. Emily listened patiently, the way you listen to a child explaining something you've already outgrown. She said the lights weren't an escape. They were an answer. That night, the fog rolled in thicker than I'd ever seen. The lights gathered offshore in numbers I couldn't count, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. Emily stepped onto the beach, stopped, and turned back to me one last time. She thanked me for holding on as long as I did. She walked forward, and instead of disappearing into the water, she stepped into the light itself. It folded around her, swallowing her silhouette without a splash, without a sound. The lights drifted back out to sea after that. Ravens Creek went quiet again. I stayed, not because I believe she'll return, but because sometimes, at dusk, one light lingers closer to shore than the others. And I can't shake the feeling it's waiting to see if grief will finally teach me where to go. After Emily vanished, the town treated me differently. People were kinder, but distant, like you are with someone carrying a contagious sadness. No one asked where she went. They already knew. The landlord stopped collecting rent. The diner comped my meals. It felt less like generosity and more like preparation, as if they were easing me toward a decision they assumed I'd eventually make. The lights returned every evening, fewer now, but closer. One hovered near the rocks, where Emily had stepped forward, pulsing gently, almost encouraging. I started dreaming of her, not as she was at the end, but as she used to be, laughing, peaceful, whole. In the dreams, she never spoke. She just stood in the glow and waited. I began walking the shoreline at dusk, telling myself it was for closure. Each night, the light adjusted its position to match mine, keeping the same careful distance. It never rushed. It didn't need to. Because the longer I stayed in Ravens Creek, the more the rest of the world felt unreal, like something I'd already left behind. The realization came slowly, and that was the cruelest part. The lights weren't guiding people away from life. They were guiding them away from waiting, away from unanswered questions, unfinished grief, and the unbearable weight of staying behind. I noticed it when I stopped dreaming about anything else. No future, no memories beyond Emily, just the shoreline and the light. I caught myself standing barefoot in the sand one evening, not remembering how I got there. The fog curled around my ankles, warm instead of cold, familiar. That's when I forced myself to leave. I packed before sunset and drove inland without looking back. Ravens Creek disappeared behind me, swallowed by mist. But the lights didn't stay behind. Sometimes, when I'm driving at night near open water, I see one pacing me offshore, just out of reach. Not calling, not chasing, just waiting. Because once the lights show you where your grief could rest, they never really stop knowing where you are. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence. A lighthouse somewhere offshore, fishing boats, reflections of streetlights in the fog. But the pattern never matched. Every time I stopped, the lights slowed. Every time I moved, it matched my pace perfectly. I realized then that Ravens Creek never really let go. It wasn't just Emily they were waiting for. It was me. I started seeing the shapes more clearly at night, the silhouettes within the lights. Not human, not fully, but vaguely familiar. Limbs bending at impossible angles, heads tilting in ways no living creature should. And yet, they didn't approach me. They studied, patient, waiting for the moment I would step willingly into the glow. Sleep became impossible. When I closed my eyes, I felt the faint tug of the tide pulling me toward the water. The lights no longer hid behind fog. They hovered just beyond reach, anticipating my surrender. I understood finally why people never returned from Ravens Creek. They didn't vanish. They walked forward. Now, I write this from somewhere far inland, but I know they still follow me. Occasionally, when the night is still and the wind carries the faint scent of salt water, I see a small glow flickering at the horizon. It's never the same place twice. It doesn't matter how far I drive or how high I climb. I have stopped trying to fight it. Ravens Creek is no longer a place, it's a presence. It waits for grief, for loss, for attention. And once it senses someone ready, it doesn't need to hurry. The lights will arrive when the time is right. I tell myself I will never go back. But some nights, staring at a dark stretch of water under the moon, I feel the pull again. The glow always comes closer, patient, inviting, perfectly still. And I know that one day I will have to follow. My name is Avery Sinclair, and this happened when I was 29, hiking alone in Blackwood Ridge, a remote area of British Columbia. I had rented a small cabin to escape city life and finish writing my first novel. The locals had warned me about the ridge. Dense forests, sudden fog, and trails that don't like to be followed. I laughed it off. Solitude was exactly what I wanted. The first night, I noticed something strange. The trees outside my window weren't still. Even in calm air, the branches twisted unnaturally, like shadows crawling over each other. At first, I blamed exhaustion. But as midnight approached, a low, wet scratching came from the back of the cabin, beneath the floorboards. Slow, deliberate, almost intelligent. I convinced myself it was a raccoon or a stray animal. But when I shone a flashlight on the crawl space, there were no tracks, no signs of entry, nothing alive, except a faint outline of scratches, forming letters I didn't recognize, deep into the wood. By the second night, the sounds had intensified. Scratching moved from the crawl space to the walls, almost like footsteps pacing just beyond the thin wooden panels. Sometimes I could hear it directly above me, on the roof, slow thuds punctuated by dragging noises. The air inside grew heavy, like the cabin was breathing around me. I tried leaving, but the fog outside was impenetrable. Every path I took seemed to circle back to the cabin. By late evening, the low whispers began. Indistinct at first, like wind through the trees. Then words formed. Names. My name. Avery. I called the owner to check if anyone else had stayed recently. He paused, then admitted no one had been allowed in for over a year. He hesitated before adding that some cabins in Blackwood Ridge have memory. They remember the presence of those who enter, and sometimes they don't want to let go. That night, I woke to a shadow crouched in the corner, unmoving, watching me. It didn't run when I screamed. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, the whispers grew louder, almost pleading now, urging me to move, to follow something I couldn't see. By the third night, I started seeing faint shapes in the corners of my vision. Tall, elongated silhouettes that seemed to stretch the walls. When I turned to look directly at them, they vanished, leaving only the faint scent of damp earth and rot. I tried recording the noises on my phone. When I listened back, the whispers were clear, not random words. They were instructions, almost conversational, like something wanted me to navigate the cabin in a very specific way. At one point, the scratching became coordinated. Taps, then drags, then taps again. Something beneath the cabin was moving, circling, waiting for me to act. The cabin no longer felt like a building. It was alive, and it knew my name, my routines, even my fears. By night 4, the cabin began to shift. Not physically, but perceptually. Doors I had locked opened on their own. Windows that faced the forest now showed only darkness. No moonlight, no trees. The whispers became coherent sentences. They told me where to step, where to look, and sometimes where not to go. One night, I found a loose floorboard in the center of the cabin. Beneath it, a shallow cavity contained small objects. Pebbles arranged in a spiral, a rusted key, and a piece of cloth that smelled faintly like my own laundry. My heart raced. The cabin was mimicking me, anticipating my movements, even leaving me clues to follow. The final straw came when I heard footsteps on the roof, moving in tandem with my breathing. I ran to the door and opened it, but the forest wasn't there. Only darkness stretched infinitely. And then, just beyond reach, 2 glowing eyes stared from the fog, unmoving, patient, and impossibly still. I stayed awake the entire 5th night, sitting rigid in a corner with a flashlight clutched in my hands. The cabin seemed to breathe around me, exhaling whispers and subtle thuds. Every creak of the wood made my chest tighten. I dared not move, except to occasionally glance at the floorboards, which seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat buried in the cabin's core. The shadow in the corner began to shift with more clarity. It stretched toward the ceiling, then crouched, then disappeared entirely, only to appear near the door. Each movement was deliberate, purposeful. It wasn't just observing me, it was studying my reactions, predicting them, and learning how to push me further. I realized then that the cabin wasn't just haunted, it was training me, testing me. The whispers promised knowledge, insight, and relief. But every step closer meant surrendering control to the house, letting it decide my reality. I understood that night. Leaving would not be simple. The cabin didn't want me to go. By night 6, my resolve began to crack. The cabin's tricks became more personal. Scratches on the floor now spelled out my fears, my regrets, even memories I'd tried to forget. When I slept, the shadows entered my dreams, twisting them until I could no longer distinguish what had happened in reality and what had happened in my imagination. I attempted to leave in daylight, only to find the forest outside had changed. Trails I had memorized disappeared, replaced by thick undergrowth, gnarled trees, and mist that seemed unnaturally heavy. The cabin, I realized, had reached beyond its walls. The entire ridge was an extension of its will. I returned inside, terrified, and for the first time, I spoke to the shadow. I asked it what it wanted. The reply came not in words, but in a sudden cold wind that blew through the cabin, extinguishing my flashlight. The floorboards creaked beneath me, forming shapes I could no longer identify. And then, silence, absolute and oppressive. By night 7, I had stopped keeping track of time. The cabin seemed to distort it, stretching minutes into hours, folding shadows over one another until I could no longer tell day from night. The whispers became urgent, almost excited. They hinted at discoveries if I followed the floorboards, if I touched the walls in certain places, if I listened closely to the echoes. Curiosity fought with terror, and I gave in. I traced the faint scratches on the walls with my fingertips. The wood shifted under my touch, forming patterns I couldn't decipher. Suddenly, the shadow appeared in front of me, towering, almost solid this time. I froze. It bent its head, and the whispers intensified. I realized it wasn't just waiting for me to leave. It wanted me to see, to understand, to acknowledge the rules of its domain. When I tried to step back, the floor seemed to rise slightly beneath my feet, subtly pushing me forward. The cabin had learned patience, and I had learned fear. That night, I finally accepted what the cabin wanted. Not my death, not my torment, but my submission, my acknowledgement that the forest, the house, the shadows, all operated by rules I could never control. I followed the scratches along the floor to a small, hidden hatch in the corner, something I had never noticed despite spending nearly a week inside. The hatch led to a crawl space beneath the cabin, narrower than a person and damp with the scent of earth and decay. Whispers guided me down, encouraging me, promising understanding and promising visions. I couldn't see far, only the beam of my flashlight, which revealed strange symbols carved into the walls of dirt. And then I saw them. Tiny, impossible humanoid figures, moving deliberately, patrolling the tunnel as if maintaining order. They froze when I entered, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I understood that the cabin was not alone. It had guardians, and I had crossed a boundary. I crawled through the hatch with trembling hands, following the whispers deeper into the earth beneath the cabin. The figures moved in silence now, keeping pace just out of reach. The tunnel widened into a hidden chamber, walls carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when I looked away. The air smelled of damp soil, old wood, and something faintly metallic, like blood or memory. The shadow appeared again, larger than ever, leaning over the chamber as if observing a chessboard. It spoke directly into my mind. You sought solitude. Solitude has sought you. My heart raced, but I couldn't turn back. I realized the cabin had been teaching me, testing my curiosity, my resolve, my fear. Each night, each whisper, each shift in the walls was a lesson I hadn't wanted but desperately needed to learn. I stood frozen as the figures bowed slightly, forming a path deeper into darkness. The cabin had accepted me, not as a visitor, but as a participant. By the 10th night, I understood the truth. The cabin wasn't malevolent. It was alive, yes, but not cruel. It was patient, methodical, a guardian of something ancient hidden beneath Blackwood Ridge. The whispers guided me, the shadows observed, and the small humanoid figures maintained order. I had trespassed into a domain older than the forest itself. I crawled back to the hatch, emerging in the dim glow of dawn. The cabin stood silently, as if nothing had happened. The forest around it was still, untouched by the chaos below. I didn't speak to anyone about what I had seen. Names, locations, and details had no meaning outside the cabin's domain. I left Blackwood Ridge that day, never to return. But sometimes, in quiet moments, I feel the cabin's presence in my mind, a reminder that solitude has rules and curiosity has consequences. I survived, but the ridge marked me forever. My name is Elena Roberts, and this happened when I was 26, hiking alone in Shadow Pines, a secluded forest in British Columbia known for its dense canopy and winding trails. I had joined a small outdoor club, hoping to escape my hectic life in the city, and Shadow Pines was the perfect spot for solitude and adventure. The first strange thing happened on my second day. I reached a trail marker I had passed the day before, only to find it pointing in the opposite direction. I thought I had misread it, but as I continued, the trail twisted unnaturally, leading me to a small clearing I didn't remember from the previous hike. The air was unnaturally still, and the usual forest sounds, the wind, birds, rustling leaves, were absent. At the center of the clearing, the shadows under the trees seemed to stretch toward me, moving slowly, deliberately, as if the forest itself was alive and watching. I felt a pull, a pressure that urged me to step off the trail. I turned back toward the trail, but the path had disappeared. The familiar markers were gone, replaced by dense underbrush that seemed to pulse under the faint light filtering through the canopy. Panic set in, but curiosity held me in place. That's when I noticed the faint whisper of footsteps behind me, not my own, soft and deliberate. I called out, but no reply came. Only the rustle of leaves answered. I tried to retrace my steps, but each turn brought me deeper into the forest, and the clearing I had passed earlier seemed to move further away, as if the forest was rearranging itself. Then I saw it. A figure at the edge of the clearing, half shrouded in shadow, standing perfectly still. I couldn't make out features, but I felt its gaze piercing through me. My heart raced, and I realized that whatever had brought me here wasn't human, and it didn't intend to let me leave easily. I tried to run, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly. Every step I took forward brought me back to the same clearing. The air grew colder, heavier, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. The shadows under the trees shifted, elongating unnaturally, creeping toward me without sound. I called out again, this time louder, and the figure moved slightly, but never approached or retreated. It simply observed, patient and silent. My fear was compounded by a strange sensation. Every time I turned my head to look in one direction, the path behind me seemed to vanish, leaving only dense forest that refused to be crossed. I realized then that the forest wasn't just hiding trails. It was alive. It had a will of its own, and I was being tested, herded, or perhaps chosen. I had to stay calm, but every instinct screamed to escape. That's when the whispering began. Soft at first, unintelligible, then forming words I could almost understand. The whispers grew clearer as night fell, guiding me to move in a specific direction. The figure remained at the edge of my vision, unwavering, almost expectant. I followed instinctively, every step making the shadows sway as if acknowledging my compliance. My breathing was shallow, heart racing, but I felt a strange compulsion to obey. Suddenly, I stumbled upon an old, moss-covered stone altar in the middle of a small clearing. The whispers crescendoed, speaking a language I didn't know yet somehow understood. The figure raised its arm, pointing toward the deeper forest. Fear told me to flee, but a force stronger than reason urged me forward. At that moment, the forest itself seemed to shift beneath my feet. Trees twisted, roots rose like barricades, and the trail I had taken vanished entirely. The figure remained, motionless, watching me as the forest decided whether I was ready to continue or be trapped forever. By the fifth night, I had lost all sense of time. The forest no longer resembled maps or trails I had studied. Every path led me in circles, back to the same moss-covered altar or the same fog-filled clearing. The shadows were no longer subtle. They stretched across the trees like living fingers, shifting and twisting in impossible ways, reacting to my every movement. The figure began to move closer, but still never crossed the line of the clearing. Its presence radiated an almost tangible authority, and the whispers became clearer. Follow, learn, survive. It was both a command and a warning. I realized that leaving the forest unprepared would be impossible. The shadow pines demanded something: attention, humility, or perhaps obedience. I followed a narrow path that appeared between two gnarled pines. The forest seemed to breathe along with me. Every step measured, every crack of a branch amplified. I understood I was not simply lost. I was being tested. The forest had rules, and every night it reminded me that they were not negotiable. The path eventually opened into a small stream cutting through the forest. The figure waited at the far side, unmoving. The whispers told me to cross, and despite the fear coiling in my chest, I obeyed. The water was ice cold, numbing my legs, but I kept moving. Every step echoed in the silence. Every ripple mirrored the distorted shapes of the trees. I looked back once and saw the shadows retreating slightly, as if allowing me passage, but still watching. My own reflection in the water was distorted, elongated, shadowed by forms I couldn't explain. The whispers became more urgent, and I realized that the forest was alive. Not malevolent, exactly, but ancient, aware, and calculating. When I reached the other side, the figure gestured toward a faint light through the trees. Relief surged, but I knew instinctively it was another test. The forest had allowed me this moment, but it had not yet released me. Every sound, every movement, every shadow was part of a larger plan I couldn't yet understand. By night 7, exhaustion had set in, but fear kept me moving. The light the figure had gestured toward was faint but steady, a warm glow that contrasted with the cold darkness pressing in from all sides. Every step closer felt like crossing a boundary I wasn't sure I wanted to. Yet some force, neither human nor natural, propelled me forward. The whispers now spoke in full sentences, a strange cadence that I could barely comprehend. They told me that the forest collected those who wandered too far, who sought solitude, who challenged its memory. It was not punishment, it was selection. Every step, every decision had been observed, measured, tested. When I finally reached the clearing with the glow, the figure moved aside, revealing an old cabin I hadn't noticed before. It looked ordinary, yet perfectly placed, like it belonged to the forest itself. The whispers softened, urging me toward its door, as if this cabin held the answers to why the shadow pines never let go. Inside the cabin, the air was thick and musky, with an earthy scent like the forest floor. Every object seemed deliberately placed. A table covered in carved symbols, shelves lined with jars filled with strange herbs and powders, and a fireplace that glowed faintly despite no fire being lit. The whispers now felt like they came from inside my head, guiding me to understand the cabin's purpose. The figure remained at the threshold, silent, watching, almost approving. I noticed a worn journal on the table. Its pages were filled with detailed accounts of lost hikers, each describing similar experiences. Twisted trails, shifting shadows, whispering voices, and the ever-present figure. I realized the forest preserved its memory in this cabin, cataloging those it tested. A sense of calm settled over me for the first time. The forest had tested me, and I had obeyed. But I knew that leaving meant taking the knowledge and the weight of shadow pines with me, a burden I would carry forever. By night 9, I had grown both wary and strangely attuned to the forest. The cabin had become a center of orientation, a beacon in the ever-shifting landscape of shadow pines. The whispers instructed me on paths that no human eye could follow, highlighting the contours of the forest that bent and twisted like a living maze. The figure followed me silently whenever I left the cabin, always keeping its distance, yet never disappearing. Every sound I made, every snap of a twig, was mirrored by subtle movements in the shadows. I understood then that the forest was not merely watching. It was aware, sentient, testing the limits of perception and patience. Eventually, I reached a small hill where the forest opened slightly. From this vantage point, the trails I had wandered were barely visible, tangled lines in an impossible puzzle. The figure gestured toward the horizon, and the whispers instructed me to step forward. It was now clear. Survival was not about strength or speed, but obedience and awareness. On the 10th night, I finally emerged at the edge of Shadow Pines, the forest reluctantly releasing me. The figure remained at the tree line, motionless, while the whispers faded into the night, leaving only a subtle echo in my mind. I realized that Shadow Pines had granted passage not out of mercy, but because it recognized my understanding of its rules. When I looked back, the trails were gone, reclaimed by the forest. Nothing remained of the maze I had navigated, save the faint glow of the cabin through the dense canopy, like a heartbeat buried in the earth. I walked away with a strange mixture of relief and reverence. The forest had not only tested me, it had marked me. Even now, whenever I hike in unfamiliar woods, I feel the forest watching, measuring, and remembering. Shadow Pines taught me that curiosity has consequences, and that some trails are meant to vanish. For those who follow too far, there may be no return. My name is Daniel Harper, and this happened when I was 28. I had rented a small, secluded lodge in Hollow Creek, British Columbia, hoping to escape the stress of my job and finish a personal writing project. The locals warned me that Hollow Creek Lodge had a history. Stories of guests vanishing, unexplained noises, and rooms that seemed to shift when no one was looking. But I dismissed it as small-town superstition. The first night, I heard something strange. Footsteps echoed across the wooden floors outside my room. Slow, deliberate, and heavy, like someone pacing. I chalked it up to old pipes or creaky floors. But then came the whispers, soft and almost indistinguishable, calling my name. I froze, realizing the sound came from inside the room, yet no one was there. The temperature dropped suddenly, and my breath became visible. Shadows along the walls lengthened unnaturally, stretching toward me like dark fingers. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but the sense of being watched grew unbearable. By the second night, the activity escalated. Objects moved on their own. My chair shifted slightly. Books fell from the shelf, and the old grandfather clock ticked backward intermittently. The whispers became clearer, repeating fragments of conversations I had never had, and sometimes they simply mimicked my own voice. I attempted to leave, but the front door seemed to resist me. It wouldn't budge no matter how hard I pushed. Windows looked out onto the same dense, fog-laden forest, yet no road or trail appeared. It was as if the lodge existed in a bubble, cut off from the world. Then I noticed the walls. They weren't stationary. They shifted imperceptibly, bending the hallways ever so slightly. The lodge wasn't haunted. It was alive, reshaping itself to manipulate me. A low scratching noise began beneath the floorboards, rhythmic, almost like it had a pattern. It wasn't random. It was waiting for me to understand it. By the third night, I could no longer ignore the presence in the lodge. The whispers had grown louder, almost conversational, repeating not just my name, but thoughts I hadn't shared aloud. I began hearing footsteps following me wherever I went. Sometimes they matched my pace exactly. Other times they lagged slightly behind, as if mocking me. The shadows along the walls seemed to detach from their surfaces, twisting into forms vaguely humanoid, yet impossibly elongated. I tried recording the noises, but my phone picked up only static and faint murmurs, as though the lodge existed in a frequency beyond normal perception. I realized that Hollow Creek Lodge didn't just observe, it learned. It adapted to my fear, exploiting it, amplifying it. Every time I tried to escape a hallway or room, the structure subtly shifted, closing off routes or stretching corridors into impossibly long passages. The lodge itself had become a predator, and I was the prey, trapped in its living, breathing interior. By the fourth night, I had stopped trying to sleep. Every creak, every whisper, every faint movement kept me alert. My nerves stretched taut. The footsteps below the floorboards became more deliberate, sometimes pausing in unison with my own steps, as though something was mimicking or responding to me. I ventured down to the lounge to investigate the sound. The room had changed. Furniture had shifted into new positions, creating a labyrinth of chairs and tables. On the wall, dark stains had appeared, forming shapes that looked like faces screaming silently. The whispers now spoke in full phrases, often contradictory, urging me toward doors that weren't there before or away from places that were safe minutes ago. Then I saw it. A dark figure standing in the corner, taller than any human, featureless, observing me. It didn't move or approach, yet its presence made my blood run cold. I understood that leaving the lodge would require navigating a maze it alone controlled. By the fifth night, exhaustion and fear had merged into a constant, aching weight. The lodge seemed to anticipate my every move. Whenever I tried to leave a room, the doors creaked shut just before I could reach them. Hallways stretched impossibly long, turning familiar corners into confusing loops. I realized that the lodge was no longer just observing. It was manipulating reality, bending space and time to keep me trapped. The whispers became more insistent, almost mocking. They called my name, then repeated my thoughts aloud, even unfinished sentences from earlier days. I followed the low scratching noises beneath the floorboards to a central room I hadn't noticed before. The floor felt unstable, like the lodge itself was testing my weight, my resolve. When I shone my flashlight into the corners, the shadows moved independently, forming vaguely humanoid shapes that bent and twisted like smoke. I understood then that the lodge had a consciousness, an intelligence that had been learning from every person who ever stayed here. And it had singled me out. By the sixth night, the lodge's manipulation had escalated. The walls now seemed to breathe, subtly moving closer or farther apart as I walked. Each hallway was a trap designed to disorient and confuse. My flashlight flickered and dimmed intermittently, casting shadows that seemed to have their own consciousness. I discovered a hidden door beneath the stairs, slightly ajar. The whispers guided me toward it, and though fear clawed at me, curiosity forced me to enter. The room beyond was small and windowless, filled with strange artifacts, broken mirrors, rusted locks, and shelves of journals from previous guests. Each journal chronicled similar experiences, distorted rooms, whispers, shadows, and ended abruptly, as if the writers had vanished mid-sentence. The figure from before appeared in the doorway, motionless, watching. I realized that the lodge didn't just haunt. It collected, preserving fragments of those who became lost within it. Survival meant understanding its rules, and every moment I hesitated. The lodge reminded me of my vulnerability. By night 7, I had begun to understand the lodge's rules, or at least I thought I had. Every hallway, every door, every flicker of shadow was part of a larger pattern. The lodge was alive, observing, testing, and manipulating me. The whispers had become clearer, guiding me through the warped halls, though always with a tone of warning. I followed one hallway to a locked door I hadn't noticed before. The whispers encouraged me to open it. Inside was a study, dimly lit with a large map of the surrounding area pinned to the wall. But the map was wrong. Trails twisted in impossible directions, forests stretched beyond natural limits, and familiar landmarks appeared in places they couldn't possibly exist. The lodge had created its own reality, one where control belonged solely to it. The figure appeared again, its form now partially illuminated by the faint light of the study. It gestured toward the map, as though offering me insight. I realized then that survival meant observing, listening, and obeying every subtle command of the lodge. By the 8th night, desperation had taken over. I moved cautiously, aware that one misstep could trigger the lodge's traps. Every creak, every flicker of light, every whisper was amplified, keeping me on edge. The walls seemed closer now, closing in as I passed, forcing me to duck or sidestep. Following the whispers, I arrived at a large, ornate fireplace I had never noticed before. Within the hearth were markings carved deep into the stone, symbols I didn't recognize, but somehow understood. The figure hovered nearby, its presence commanding yet patient. I traced the symbols with my fingers, feeling a strange warmth in my hands. The whispers shifted, almost approving, guiding me to place my palm flat on the stone. Immediately, the lodge seemed to relax slightly, the walls straightening, the shadows retreating. I realized that the lodge didn't simply torment. It demanded understanding and respect. The figure watched, waiting for me to learn its lessons fully before granting any semblance of freedom. By night 9, I had begun to feel a strange rhythm to the lodge's movements, a pulse I could almost anticipate. The shadows no longer just followed, they guided. The whispers now spoke clearly, telling me which halls to take, which doors to avoid, and when to remain still. Every step became a test of my understanding and obedience. I moved carefully through a corridor that had twisted and stretched, following the faint echo of the figure's presence. At the end of the hallway, I discovered a hidden staircase descending beneath the lodge, previously unnoticed. The whispers urged me down, warning me that what I would see below would change my perception forever. Hesitant but compelled, I descended into darkness, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. Below, the lodge revealed its secret, a vast cellar filled with remnants of past guests. Objects, journals, clothing, all preserved as if frozen in time. The figure hovered silently, waiting to see how I would react, testing my fear, my curiosity, and my respect for its domain. On the 10th night, I finally understood what survival required. The lodge had tested me, guided me, and forced me to confront both fear and obedience. The whispers receded, and the shadows withdrew slightly, giving me a clear path toward the exit. The figure stood at the threshold, silent, as if granting me permission to leave. When I emerged into the cold night air, the lodge seemed still and ordinary, as if nothing had occurred inside. The forest around it was quiet, untouched by the chaos I had witnessed. I walked away, carrying the memory of Hollow Creek Lodge like a scar etched into my mind. I realized that some places are not merely haunted. They are sentient, observing, teaching, and testing those who dare enter. Even now, years later, whenever I hear creaking floors or distant whispers, I remember the lodge and the lessons it imparted. Fear can be a guide, curiosity can be dangerous, and survival sometimes demands obedience to forces beyond comprehension. My name is Henry Calloway, and this happened when I was 32. I had taken a temporary position as the lighthouse keeper at Stormwatch Point, a desolate cliffside in British Columbia battered by relentless winds and crashing waves. The previous keeper had vanished without explanation, leaving only a cryptic note. The light sees everything, but it cannot save you. I dismissed it as superstition, The first night, as the fog rolled in from the ocean, I noticed shadows moving unnaturally along the cliff's edge. The wind carried faint whispers, like the sea itself was speaking to me. At first, I attributed the sounds to the storm, but the whispers grew coherent, repeating my name, sometimes in a tone of warning, sometimes of mockery. The lighthouse itself began to feel alive. The metal railing vibrated with unseen energy, the light at the top pulsed irregularly, and the walls seemed to hum, resonating with an almost sentient presence. I felt that something, or someone, was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. By the second night, the storm had worsened. Waves pounded the rocks below with terrifying force, yet the whispers persisted, even when the wind seemed to drown out all other sound. They spoke of secrets hidden in the lighthouse, of previous keepers who had failed to understand. I began to notice the stairs inside the tower creaking under invisible weight, as if someone, or something, was descending toward me. Objects in the lighthouse moved subtly. Logs in the fireplace shifted positions, tools on the shelves slightly displaced, and the brass telescope occasionally pointed toward areas of the cliff I had not yet explored. Shadows flickered across the walls, elongated and distorted, behaving as though they had their own awareness. I realized I was not alone. Something had claimed Stormwatch Point as its domain, using the storm, the cliffs, and the lighthouse itself as instruments to test my resolve. Every sound, every movement, every shadow was a challenge, and failing could have consequences I didn't dare imagine. By the third night, the presence in the lighthouse had grown more assertive. The walls seemed to vibrate with whispers that no human voice could produce. I could feel them crawling along the wood and stone, seeping into my mind, hinting at secrets I was not yet ready to understand. Every creak of the stairs and gust of wind through the broken windows was amplified into a warning or a threat. I climbed to the top of the lighthouse to inspect the light, only to find it swinging slightly, even though the storm outside was still at its peak. Shadows twisted unnaturally along the metal railing, forming shapes that were almost human, but not quite. I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the cliff, unmoving, watching me. Yet when I blinked, it vanished. By now, fear had become a companion. I realized that the lighthouse was alive in a way I couldn't comprehend. It observed, it tested, and it demanded attention. One misstep could make the cliff or the tower my final resting place. By the fourth night, the presence had begun to communicate more clearly. The whispers now repeated coherent phrases: "Watch the horizon, obey the light, do not fall behind." I noticed that certain panels in the lighthouse walls shifted imperceptibly, revealing hidden alcoves filled with old logs, journals, and tools from previous keepers. Curiosity pulled me toward one of these hidden spaces. Inside, I found a collection of notes, scribbled frantically. Warnings about the cliffs, the tides, and the observer that haunted the tower. One note caught my attention. "The light does not forgive. Follow its rules or join the others." My skin crawled as the reality sank in. I was part of a long lineage of keepers, each tested by something far older and more intelligent than human. The shadows moved in unison along the walls, reacting to my presence, almost nudging me toward understanding. The storm raged outside, but inside, a different, slower terror held me captive. The lighthouse itself, alive and aware, demanding vigilance and obedience with every flicker of its eternal light. By the fifth night, exhaustion and unease had become inseparable companions. The wind howled relentlessly outside, but inside the lighthouse, a quieter, more insidious presence dominated. Shadows along the walls no longer simply followed me. They moved independently, twisting and bending into impossible forms. I could feel them stretching toward me, testing my reactions and probing my fears. The journals I had found earlier contained repeated warnings about the cliffs. The previous keepers had noted seeing the observer, a tall, shadowed figure, along the edge, always watching, always judging. One journal detailed a stormy night where a keeper had ignored the whispers and vanished without a trace. I realized the lighthouse was teaching me the same lesson. Vigilance was survival. Disobedience was death. I climbed to the lantern room once more, feeling the boards creak beneath my weight as though conscious. The lights swung in rhythm with the whispers, a silent language I was only beginning to understand. I sensed that every flicker, every shadow, and every gust of wind carried meaning, and failing to interpret it correctly could be fatal. By the sixth night, the observer revealed more of itself. Standing at the edge of the cliff, it remained featureless but imposing, its presence filling the entire lighthouse with silent menace. I realized that the figure was not just a ghost. It was the embodiment of the lighthouse itself, a sentinel bound to Stormwatch Point for centuries. The whispers instructed me to follow a precise routine. Check the light every hour, monitor the cliff edge, and respond to any anomaly immediately. Deviating from the pattern caused shadows to thicken, forming walls that blocked doors and distorted corridors. The lighthouse seemed to shift, a living maze designed to punish mistakes. I began to understand the delicate balance between fear and obedience. Every decision mattered. The observer watched not just my actions, but my thoughts, my hesitation, my instinct. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm within the walls, the weight of centuries of watchful eyes pressing down on me, reminding me that survival was earned through respect, vigilance, and unwavering attention to the lighthouse's silent commands. By night 7, I had begun to synchronize with the lighthouse's rhythm. I moved deliberately, following the observer's silent cues and the whisper's subtle guidance. Every step, every glance toward the cliff, every rotation of the lantern's light became part of a delicate pattern I was learning to respect. Any deviation brought an immediate response. Walls seemed to lean in, shadows elongated, and the air grew heavier, pressing against my chest. The observer remained on the cliffs, silently judging, almost approving when I followed the patterns correctly. I discovered more hidden alcoves along the spiral staircase, each containing remnants of previous keepers, worn coats, journals, and personal effects frozen in time. The lodge, or rather, the lighthouse, was preserving them, teaching lessons through terror, observation, and the consequences of failure. For the first time, I felt a fragile understanding forming. Survival wasn't about strength or courage. It was about attention, obedience, and learning to read the silent language of the lighthouse. The storm outside became secondary to the storm within these walls. By night 8, the lighthouse had become almost a companion, an oppressive, sentient presence that I both feared and respected. The whispers guided my every movement, alerting me to subtle changes in the walls, shadows, and wind patterns. The observer remained vigilant on the cliff, a dark silhouette against the stormy horizon, reminding me that it had eyes everywhere. The journals had become more than warnings. They were instructions. I began to anticipate events. A floorboard creak, a sudden gust, a flicker of the lantern light. I moved with precision, following routines that previous keepers had recorded, adapting them to the patterns I observed. Each successful navigation of a trap, each moment of obedience, allowed the lighthouse to ease its hold, just enough for me to feel momentary relief. I understood that the lighthouse's true power was not fear alone. It was the ability to train, to test, and to reshape reality around those who dared enter its domain. Survival was not granted. It was earned. By night 9, I had learned to anticipate the lighthouse's subtle manipulations. The observer remained at the cliff edge, unmoving yet all-seeing. Shadows inside the tower now seemed to move in patterns, almost signaling messages. Every creak, every gust, every flicker of light had meaning, and I followed them as one might follow a map written in code only the initiated could read. The storm outside raged with relentless fury, but the real danger was inside. I discovered another hidden chamber beneath the floorboards, lined with journals, drawings, and tools left by keepers who had failed to obey. Some entries ended abruptly, with words smudged by tears or blood. I realized then that the lighthouse was patient. It did not kill recklessly. It taught, observed, and waited for mistakes, preserving evidence of failure as a lesson for those who followed. I understood my task: remain vigilant, obey the patterns, and respect the observer's unspoken rules. Survival depended entirely on learning the lighthouse's language, one night at a time. On the 10th night, the observer finally allowed me a reprieve. Following the coded instructions of whispers and shadows, I navigated the tower flawlessly, maintaining the precise routines I had learned. The lantern's light swung in steady rhythm, casting long shadows that no longer threatened but guided me toward the exit. Stepping outside into the cold dawn air, I felt the full weight of the lighthouse's presence lift slightly, though its vigilance remained. The cliffs below crashed with unyielding waves, and the fog rolled in from the ocean as if cleansing the land. I realized I had been tested, observed, and ultimately deemed competent, not by courage or strength, but by attention, respect, and obedience. Even now, years later, I feel the lighthouse watching from afar, a silent sentinel. I carry its lessons with me. Fear can teach, vigilance can save, and some places are alive in ways humans can barely comprehend. To disregard them is to risk never leaving. My name is Lena Morrison, and this happened when I was 25. I was driving late one night along Evergreen Highway, a remote stretch of road in British Columbia known for dense forests and sudden fog. I had finished a long shift at the hospital and was eager to get home, but the road ahead seemed endless, shrouded in darkness. About an hour in, I noticed a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a man, dressed in dark clothing, motionless, and staring toward the approaching headlights. Feeling uneasy, I slowed down and rolled the window halfway. "Do you need a ride?" I asked. He didn't respond immediately, only stepping closer as if to wait for me to open the door. Something about him made my stomach twist. A presence that was off, unnatural, and unnervingly silent. When I reluctantly unlocked the door and he slid inside, I realized the temperature in the car plummeted instantly. My breath became visible, even though the heater was on full. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like something was pressing down on me. Once inside, the passenger said nothing. I tried small talk, asking where he was headed, but he only stared straight ahead, hands resting unnaturally still on his knees. The road behind us seemed to stretch endlessly, the headlights illuminating nothing but fog and black trees. Every mile felt slower than the last, as though the highway itself had warped to trap us. Then the radio flickered on unexpectedly, static and distorted voices whispering fragments of my name. I slammed the dial off, but the whispers persisted, carried by the cold draft circulating in the car. I realized this was no ordinary hitchhiker. He was something else, something not entirely human, feeding on fear and isolation. When I glanced at him again, I noticed subtle changes. His features were blurred, like smoke or shadow, and his eyes reflected none of the dim light in the car. Panic surged as I gripped the wheel, realizing that driving faster only seemed to prolong the journey, as if the highway itself conspired with him. By the third night, the third hour of driving that seemed to stretch on forever, the silence became unbearable. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong. The figure beside me remained eerily still, his presence filling the car with a suffocating weight. I tried to shake him awake with conversation, but his lips never moved. Instead, shadows in the corners of the windshield seemed to grow darker, twisting and stretching as if alive. Suddenly, I noticed the rearview mirror reflected more than just the empty road. Behind me, fog thickened unnaturally, forming shapes that resembled figures from nightmares, their faces pressed close to the glass. I couldn't look away, yet the passenger's presence remained cold, calm, almost commanding. My heart raced as the realization sank in. I was not simply driving through fog. I was being guided, herded, trapped. Every instinct told me to stop, to pull over. But something deep inside whispered that doing so would be far worse than continuing down this endless, haunted highway. By the fourth hour, fear had turned into a cold, focused alertness. I noticed subtle things about the passenger. His breathing was imperceptible, yet the car's temperature dropped further whenever he shifted slightly. The fog outside thickened in response to our movements, as though the highway itself was alive, conspiring with him. Then, something moved in the back seat. I whipped around, only to see a fleeting shadow vanish into the corner. The radio flickered again, this time whispering coherent phrases. "You shouldn't be here. You can't escape." My hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles white as the road seemed to stretch unnaturally before me, every turn repeating, looping, impossible to navigate. The passenger finally spoke, but only a single word, low and resonant. "Welcome." The word chilled me to the bone. I realized then that he wasn't just a person, a hitchhiker, or even a ghost. He was the highway, the fog, and the darkness made flesh. A silent predator whose only joy was watching fear grow. By the fifth hour, I was fully aware that I had entered a space where normal rules didn't apply. The passenger remained silent, his featureless form exuding a presence that seemed to seep into every corner of the car. The road ahead became an endless black ribbon, twisting and stretching beyond any sense of distance. I felt disoriented, as if time itself had slowed, trapped in this corridor of fog and shadow. Every attempt to speed up or change lanes was met with resistance, not mechanical but psychological. The car felt heavier, the steering almost resisting my hands. Outside, the fog formed faint figures mimicking my movements, observing, testing. I realized that the passenger wasn't just in the car. He controlled the environment, the highway, and even the perception of movement. Fear became a tool, sharpened and precise. I focused on one thought: survive. One wrong move, and I suspected the highway itself would consume me. I had to obey, observe, and remain aware of every subtle shift in the shadows and fog. By the sixth hour, the highway seemed fully alive. Trees along the roadside twisted impossibly, branches reaching toward the car, scraping the roof as if trying to pull it into the forest. The passenger remained silent, but the weight of his presence pressed against my chest. I noticed subtle changes. Road signs appeared twice. Faded lines curved unnaturally, and the asphalt rippled as though breathing. I tried to call for help on my phone, but the signal was gone. Every number dialed rang endlessly without connection. Even GPS and maps failed, looping back to the same stretch of highway. It became clear. This was not a normal road. I was trapped in a living, shifting nightmare, and the passenger was its master. Panic clawed at me, but I forced calm. I observed the subtle patterns, the flicker of headlights against the fog, the slight sway of the passenger's shadow, and the rhythm of the trees. I realized that understanding these patterns was my only chance of survival, and that any misstep could have consequences far beyond death. By the 7th hour, my focus had sharpened into a tense, instinctive awareness. Every flicker of fog, every whisper of wind, every shadow along the road held meaning. The highway wasn't just a path, it was a trap, alive and patient. And the passenger was its agent, silently guiding me through a maze that seemed to exist outside reality itself. I noticed subtle signs that previous drivers had left behind: torn scraps of paper, bent road markers, and scratched initials on the guardrails. They were warnings, or perhaps clues, left by those who had encountered the same entity and survived long enough to leave messages. The passenger remained still, but I could feel his awareness pressing into me, judging my choices, waiting for hesitation. The car's interior felt smaller, the shadows thicker. Every decision, every slight movement of the wheel could provoke an unseen consequence. I realized that my only hope was observation and obedience, reading the silent language of the highway and moving in perfect harmony with its dark rhythm. By the 8th hour, exhaustion and fear merged into hyper-awareness. The fog thickened unnaturally, reducing visibility to only a few meters. Yet I could somehow anticipate the road's twists and turns, as if guided by the passenger's silent instruction. Trees bent toward the car, shadows flickered and shifted unnaturally, and the asphalt seemed to ripple beneath the tires. Suddenly, the passenger moved. Just a slight shift, enough to make me notice. The temperature in the car plummeted further, breath visible in sharp clouds. I realized then that he wasn't simply along for the ride. He was teaching me, guiding me, warning me of what would happen if I faltered. The highway itself became a living instructor, with lessons written in fog, shadows, and fear. I gripped the wheel tighter, focusing on the pattern, the rhythm, the silent cues. Survival required attention, respect, and obedience. And I understood that the slightest deviation could mean becoming yet another lost warning along this cursed stretch of road. By the 9th hour, I had fallen into a strange rhythm with the highway and the passenger. The fog seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, and shadows stretched and contracted like living things. The road ahead looped endlessly, each turn eerily familiar, yet subtly altered, as if the highway itself were alive and shaping my path. The passenger remained motionless, featureless, yet his presence filled every corner of the car, pressing into my mind. I realized he was not only observing me, he was testing me. Any hesitation, any flicker of fear, would have consequences far beyond imagination. My survival depended entirely on understanding the silent language of the highway, on predicting every twist, every shadow, and every flicker of fog. I gripped the steering wheel, forcing my focus onto the smallest details: the sway of tree branches, the rhythm of the fog, the faint creak of metal guardrails. Obeying these cues was my only chance to escape the silent passenger's relentless control. By the 10th hour, the highway seemed to relent slightly. Following the silent cues perfectly, I navigated the twists and turns without hesitation. The fog thinned just enough to reveal the faint outlines of the forest receding, and the road ahead straightened for the first time in hours. The passenger remained still beside me, but I could sense his judgment had passed. I had survived the test. As I approached a small town at the highway's end, the temperature returned to normal, and the oppressive weight of his presence lifted. When I finally turned to look at him, he was gone, vanished as though he had never existed. Yet the memory of his silence, the lessons learned, and the haunting rhythm of that cursed highway remain etched into my mind forever. Even now, I never drive alone along remote roads. I remember that some highways are alive, some passengers are eternal, and fear can teach lessons far more lasting than time itself. As our journey through the darkest corners of British Columbia comes to an end, we are reminded that terror does not always reside in distant lands or fictional tales. From the haunted lodges hidden deep in forests, to the sentient lighthouses watching every move, to the cursed highways where the fog itself becomes a predator. These stories show us that the line between reality and nightmare is thinner than we think. Each encounter we explored tonight was not a legend or campfire tale. These were documented experiences, real horrors faced by ordinary people. People whose lives were forever changed by forces beyond comprehension. From abandoned farmhouses to shadowed cliffs, from silent passengers to lurking observers, the terror we witnessed was intimate, personal, and haunting. Remember, fear is a teacher, and vigilance can be your only shield in places where darkness is alive. Keep your eyes open, respect the unknown, and perhaps, just perhaps, you may avoid becoming the next story whispered in the fog. Thanks for watching. This was Dark Fears.